My grandfather died the day Obama was inaugurated. Word around the family was that he just couldn't handle the hope. I know he loved his family because I choose to know it. The way he knew how to express this love was to constantly warn us of the certain doom toward which we were hurtling, both as individuals and as society. He was a man comforted by extreme conservative talk radio. The millennium shift was a particularly exciting time for my grandfather because finally others were participating in this dreadful anticipation of disaster. He encouraged the family to invest in barrels of water, chemical toilets, powdered food. Some did, like my mom, though I suspect it was more to make her dear father-in-law feel validated than anything else. As for me, my little apartment in Los Angeles was not going to accommodate a new passion for hoarding, so I just decided to expect a smooth transition. And even in the event of a world-ending catastrophe, I assume my preference would probably be to go out with the first wave, rather than crawl from a hole in the ground, sick with radiation, to begin the process of cleaning up the dead. I just don't think that would feel much like winning. However, I knew I didn't want to be in Los Angeles when the year, decade, century, and millennium turned all at once. You see, LA riots at the slightest provocation. The Lakers lost, let's burn a police car! Or, the Lakers won, let's burn a police car! So I decided to spend the holiday here in the Bay Area with my family. I went to a party, and then spent the night at my grandparents' house on the fold-out couch in the living room. January 1st, 2000, at about 7 a.m., I awoke to the sound of the sliding glass door opening. It was my grandfather stepping outside for his morning cigarette and scotch. Happy New Year, grandfather! The world didn't end. We're all still here. It's not an event, Adrian. It's a process. For him, this was optimism. He was bravely holding on to his dreams, even when it looked like they wouldn't come true. 25 years earlier, he was equally committed to his extreme ideologies, but with the passion and enthusiasm of the middle-aged. For him, this involved a membership in the John Birch Society, a lot of crazy literature, and getting together with like-minded friends to drink bourbon and shoot guns in the backyard. I should tell you up front, we Abbotts are not capable of conspiracy. On normal days, we wrestle with the extremes of who we are, and on good days, we can articulate who we are. What we cannot do is pretend to be what we are not. Even if my grandfather had attempted to thwart what the government was doing, I have to wonder what he and his cohorts could have accomplished from Danville, which in the 70s was just a little cow town. I imagine it would have been akin to Sheriff Andy Taylor and Deputy Barney Fife recruiting Floyd the Barber to overthrow the government from Mayberry. So there was no conspiracy, but I'm sure that to the FBI, it must have looked for all the world like a conspiracy when my grandfather helped an acquaintance acquire a gun that would be used in San Francisco the very next day to make an attempt on President Gerald Ford's life. I'm not talking about Squeaky Fromme. That was a different attempt on Ford's life. 2.5 weeks earlier, a stressful month for him. Now, when Squeaky Fromme pointed her gun at the president, my grandmother, Barbara, delightful wife to the grumpy John Bircher, was watching the news with her friend Sarah Jane. And she laughed and wondered aloud, why on earth would anyone want to kill Ford? What's he going to do but trip and hurt himself, the poor man? Sarah Jane laughed and agreed that it doesn't make much sense at all. Flash forward 2.5 weeks. My grandmother is, again, watching a story on the news about an attempt on Ford's life. Only this time she isn't laughing. In fact, she is realizing, with increasing concern, that the assailant this time is not some poor, deranged youth, but rather her friend, Sarah Jane Moore. As the family gathered around the television, piecing the story together, my grandfather paled and said, "Well, I guess this puts my friend Mark in an interesting position." My father asked, "Why?" "Well, he sold Sarah Jane a gun yesterday." "Does he know about this?" I don't know. Well, do you think we should tell him? I suppose we should. They tried calling Mark, but he wasn't home. This was before cell phones and even answering machines. Do any of you remember when you just had to be home to get a phone call? At any rate, they drove to Mark's house, and as they pulled up in front, they saw Mark's car pull into the driveway and another car park across the street. My father ran up to Mark and said, "Yesterday, you sold a gun to Sarah Jane Moore. Is that correct?" "Yes." "Today, she used that gun to take a shot at Ford." As the shock began to descend on Mark, two men approached from the car across the street, flashing badges. "Good afternoon, we'd like to speak with you, please." And they went inside. But he knew! My father often brings this up. He didn't go in there blind. Now, my dad will still get riled up when he talks about this. I was a new father. You were still in swaddling clothes, so all my hormonal protective instincts were kicking in. And Sarah Jane called and asked your mom and me if her son could stay with us for a few days. Well, he's a great kid. It was no problem. Well, what she failed to mention were the photographs she'd received in the mail of her and her son, presumably sent by the SLA. Wait. The SLA? As in the Symbionese Liberation Army? Well, yes. You know about Patty Hearst being kidnapped, right? Well, part of the ransom was this food giveaway, and Sarah Jane was an accountant on this project, and apparently in some contact with the FBI, and as it turns out, the SLA. So, at any rate, she gets these photographs in the mail, the message being, "We can get to you." So what does she do? She asks Mom and me to watch her son. Does she mention this potential threat to our safety? No. Does she give a shit about this threat? Probably not. So weeks later, I'm watching the ensuing shootouts on the news, and I'm thinking, she brought my family into this? She brought my child into contact with this? Oh no. Fuck her! I'm so glad you found peace after that. So my dad's grudge is still firmly in place. My grandmother, on the other hand, maintained a loyalty to her friend. For Grandma Barbara, there was no option but graciousness. Even in the chaos immediately following the shooting, she remained remarkably herself. When word got out that a local family had been involved in a national incident, the press descended like a swarm of insects on this little house in Danville. My grandmother, upon realizing that a young, out-of-town reporter was staying in a local motel, insisted that he stay there with them. Again, this was just her way. Now, when my father got wind of this, he was more than a little suspicious. "Mom, do you even know what publication he works for?" "Well, no." "Do you have any way of knowing he is who he says he is? Do you really think this is a good idea?" "He is a guest in our home, and he will be treated as such." It may have been stuff like this that drove my dad crazy when it came to his family. But regardless of whom it drove crazy, my grandmother insisted on being kind and generous to everyone she met. This included strange reporters and her friend, the attempted assassin. Now, I gradually became aware of all of this as I was growing up because Sarah Jane would call my grandmother's house on holidays. This is the Federal Women's Correctional Facility in Dublin. I call from, "It's Sarah Jane, dears!" This could get awkward, depending on who answered the phone. On one of his first Thanksgivings with the family, my Uncle Marty had what I'm sure was the surreal experience of handing the phone to his new mother-in-law and saying, "It's for you, apparently it's Sarah Jane Moore." Grandmother always took the call, because she knew that at this point, the Abbotts were the closest thing to family Sarah Jane had. The ease with which she maintained this and all of her friendships was just a very small part of what made Grandma Barbara so amazing. She was nicknamed the Oracle by family and friends because, well, "Grandmother, who was that lady with the fruit on her head again?" "Carmen Miranda, dear." "Thank you, that has been driving me crazy." "Of course, darling, what are grandmothers for, after all?" In one of my first apartments, I heard a child screaming one day. I didn't know what to do. So I called Grandma Barbara. Grandmother, there is some woman in my building beating the hell out of her child, and I want to call the police, but I don't want to make anything worse, and I don't know what to do. She simply said, well, darling, you have to call. And so I did. She was a Shakespeare aficionado who could throw quotes with the same cool flow of a jazz musician. She had this grand air about her that made her the kind of woman a drag queen would want to imitate. And the fact that she was a tall, fabulous redhead didn't hurt things either. But even as she amazed, enlightened, and inspired imitation, she had this way of connecting to you and delighting in you that made you feel like you were the most important person in the world. Adrian, darling, how marvelous to hear from you. Well, I think just saying hello is a perfectly fine reason to call. Things around here are splendid. Well, the amaryllis has grown completely beyond any notion of propriety. I've said, now really, I think it's time we tried reason for a change, but the flower continues to grow, becoming increasingly ostentatious by the moment, which is just fine, I suppose. The pastor at church is on vacation, so I gave the sermon this morning. I know, darling, I wish you could have been there too. Your Aunt Margaret did come, though. Yes, I thought it might do her some good. She had been telling me lately that God is feeling like a harsh judge, doling out little favors only after one has toiled and begged. I said, now, dear, you mustn't confuse God with your father. Yes, that is pretty good, isn't it? Yes, darling. I'll let you go now. I do feel so fortunate that I have all of you, and I know how lucky I am. It is so important to remember, and hard when life is running at top speed. It's often easy to think of what you might have missed. I think of the opportunities I have seized and the love I have savored. Particularly, I think of you, and I love you. Bye-bye, darling. In 2001, the unthinkable happened when Grandma Barbara died of a massive heart attack. It's been almost 10 years, but I would be lying if I said I didn't still miss her in an acute way. Needless to say, immediately following her death, I was overwhelmed with grief, feeling desperate to live up to her legacy and woefully inadequate to do so. It was this set of conflicting feelings that led me to begin writing and visiting Sarah Jane myself. My thinking was that with grandmother gone, she had lost her only friend. And this is where the story obviously changed for me, because suddenly it was my story too, and the scenery had shifted dramatically.